Okay, so good afternoon again to everybody. My name is Lindsay Leach Sparks, and I am one of the co-founders of Sparks Creative, and I teach all of our theory classes. So we have a pretty wide range of things that we offer, and one of our sort of projects for the spring was to start looking at kind of the theory knowledge that kind of middle school or sort of intermediate students have, and then see if we could offer something that would build on that. So we're kind of just gonna see how this goes this afternoon. One of the things, we have a 3-part series, right? So I thought maybe what we would do is talk about notation today, and then the next time we'll talk about rhythm and all things rhythm. And then the following time we'll talk about form, which is a little bit of a deeper subject, but I think if we set it up with notes and rhythms, we'll be able to kind of get there. So it sounds like most of us here play an instrument. You might already, be fully aware of how to read music, but let's just start at the basics. And then if this is super easy, we'll just kind of keep going as far as we can go in the next 20 minutes or 30 minutes. So first things first, we know that these 5 lines, well, before I tell you, anybody know what these 5 lines are called together?
Staffs.
The staff. Yeah, exactly. The staff is something that is a pretty stable fixture in music. It's evolved over time. It used to be that we just had a single line and we would write little squiggles all over the place, and that was called a diastematic notation. And that sort of told the people reading where to start and how high to sing and how low to sing, and maybe which places got more syllables or fewer syllables, but it wasn't very specific at all. And that evolved into 2 lines. At least you could tell where you started and what your upper note should be. And then that eventually evolved into 4 lines. And that's when we started to see neumes and funny notation that, oops, if I can get my writing tool out, funny notation that looks like this. Like little boxes, right? We get that a lot in our 4-voice notation. That was definitely before the common practice period that we usually talk about when we're talking about music. That was probably about 12 or 1300. And then by the time the 15th century, 16th century, the Renaissance started rolling around, we got kind of a 5-line staff, and we've had it ever since. So that's where that comes from. On the staff, we always have something called a clef. Now, flute players, since you all are flutists here, always play in what we call the treble clef, right? Sometimes this is called the G clef. And so we call it the G clef because this line right here in the center, not center, but the bottom center of our staff is kind of looped around with our treble clef. Okay, so that's G. So we call it a G clef. If we know that's G, we can put the rest of the notes on the staff. And when you first started learning note names, did you learn any like fun sayings or acronyms to go along with what the notes were on the staff?
Yeah, like every good boy does fine, and FACE, face.
That's right, exactly. So we've got face, right? And then every good boy does fine. And this is all old hat, right? Every good boy does fine. And of course, there's all kinds of fun other things that you can come up with probably, to remember those. And then again, as flutists, we see this a lot. We started branching off the staff. Okay, so we have things called ledger lines. Ledger lines. And it basically is just an extension of the staff because our range goes pretty high and pretty low, right? So below the staff, we get a D, and then the ledger line below that is a C, right? We play down to low C pretty frequently. The ledger lines here, we've got G is the space above the staff, and then our first ledger line is A. And of course, this can kind of keep going in any direction, right? As many ledger lines as we need. And for flute, we often see 5 ledger lines. I mean, it gets up there, right? So the basic gist of learning the clef anyway is just being able to identify what's a line, what's a space, right? Making sure that A and C, for example, don't get flip-flopped around in our brain, right? We have that all the time. Then we can even add to this, not changing the clef yet, but we can add to this where we have sharps and flats. So we'll talk a little bit more specifically when we talk rhythm, but generally speaking, if we have a note head on a staff and it's above this center line, so for us, this is B, right? Anything above the staff, the stem tends to go down. If we have notes below the staff, the stem tends to go up. And it's always down on the left and up on the right, which is, I have to say, something that we don't practice maybe all the time anymore, because we have these really cool programs like MuseScore or Note Flight, or anything like that, where it's a notation program, and you can literally just say to your computer, okay, I want an A, and it just boop pops it up there, or you move it with your arrow keys, and then the stem on the note changes automatically. So again, this is probably a little bit of a review for the people here today, but just for the video. So this is the note head, right? And then this is what we call the stem. Now, when these become eighth notes, the flag on the eighth note always goes off to the right. And then we'll talk about this again with rhythm. Then we can start beaming them too. Okay. And then of course, the beam is kind of dependent on where the stem went, whether it went up or down. Okay, so to the rest of these note heads, then we can start adding this stuff. Okay, sharps, flats, and naturals, if we wanted to add a natural, put that in here. All right, and again, this is probably all very old hat stuff, right? I would bet if you've been playing flute all year long, this is easy. Let's talk about the other clef, and then we're going to talk about something called enharmonic notes. Okay. And actually, if I'm being as thorough as possible, we actually have 2 other clefs. And now this is something that flutists don't always know or play in. If you've played piano, then you might have come across this. Okay. So the other very, very, very common clef is the bass clef. Okay. It looks a little bit like, I don't know, like a rounded 7 or a backwards C. I don't know how you want to think about it. And it has these little dots. Okay. The 2 little colon like dots. This clef is called the F clef. Okay. So we had treble clef up here. That was also called the G clef. And then down below, the bass clef, which is called the F clef. Now, one of the things about the F clef is that the range is much lower, and I'll touch on that in a second when we talk about the movable C clef in the middle. But generally speaking, bass clef instruments are instruments like cello or bass, string bass, trombone, tuba, right? They all play in the bass clef. So do you remember, have you guys learned the bass clef, the lines and spaces on the bass clef?
No, I don't think I have, Lindsay. I may have seen it, but just really the trouble.
So let's go through this one. And actually, I'll tell you what, I'm going to move my F over because we're going to have a lot more down below. Okay. Oh, and I said, if you play piano, you might have seen this, because generally speaking, treble clef is the right hand of the piano, bass clef is the left hand of the piano. So you might have seen it if you've ever, played around piano music. Anyway, so looking at the lines, in fact, we can kind of do lines and spaces together. So if we count up from the F, we've got G, and then A, on the line above. Okay, coming down, we have the F, E in the space, D on the line, C in the space, B on the line, A in the space, and then G on the line. So we're literally just doing exactly the same thing that we did in treble clef. And since I mentioned piano, I'll kind of draw our little keyboard out here so you can see what we're doing. This is my makeshift keyboard. I tell my music theory students to learn how to draw a makeshift keyboard. So it's very useful sometimes. Okay, I'll draw 2 more so we have a little bit more here. There we go. Okay, so that's our keyboard. So we are going basically from the bottom. This is a G here, and we're literally just going right up the scale. So A, and then it's the alphabet from there. B, C, D, E, F, G, and then A up above. Okay. So what we're getting to, in fact, you know what? Now that I look at this, let me move this down a little bit so it's correct. Because I put my 2 black keys in a different spot. G is here. There we go. G, A, B, and then the rest. C, D, E, F, etc. Okay. Okay. Getting back to the bass clef, we can do the exact same thing that we did with the treble clef, and we can basically do ledger lines on either side. So again, if you're, a cellist, you're going to end up with a couple of ledger lines down this way. So G, F is under the staff, E is on the first line, D is underneath the first line, C is the second line down. And then you can also go above. So G, A, B, C, D, and then it can kind of keep going. And then of course, we also have the same kind of accidentals, right? That can apply to any clef. Okay, accidentals. Now, there's another one. So hold on for a second. If you are a viola player, okay, you're actually going to play in something called the alto clef or the movable C clef. So what does this one look like? This one is a line, and it basically looks like a big B. Sometimes you see 2 lines, right? But it's a big B. And basically the spot where the 2 bumps of the B meet, that's middle C. Okay. And we'll talk about middle C in a minute in relation to the keyboard, just so that you have a frame of reference for that too. But this is middle C. Sometimes for people that don't play in this clef very often, it's kind of hard to remember how to draw it, right? And I always remember the way that this is drawn because my very, very, very first year teaching music theory, I also taught orchestra. And I had a girl in my orchestra who was a viola player who taught theory, or who was in my theory class, who I taught in theory. And her name was Becky. And I was doing this whole thing for my AP theory class, the first day or second day, and we were going over notes and how to read music and all that stuff. And I said, okay, what clef is this? And she said, oh, that's the Becky clef. So my viola player, Becky, says it's the Becky clef. And that's an easy way to remember that. It just looks like a big B. Okay, so what's the deal with this clef? Like I said, this is middle C. So I'm going to get to middle C in a minute, but go along with me for now. We're just going to do the exact same process for this clef that we did for the treble and the bass clefs, right? So we have C, and up here to D. Oops. That's not very clear. Let me erase that and do it again. There we go. Okay, C, D. E is on a line. F is on a space. G is on a line. And then we come back down. So B is on a space. A is on a line. G is on a space. F is on a line. And E is underlined. And same thing here, A is above the line. And we can do the same with the ledger lines and keep going, you know, as much as we want here. The really interesting thing about this clef, okay, is that it is movable. So I don't know if you caught that earlier. It is a movable C clef. So let's say you're a cellist, okay, and you're playing really high up on the fingerboard. You're actually going to go pretty far above the bass clef, and you're going to have lots and lots of ledger lines. Now, as flutists, we play in the treble clef. That's as high as it gets, and we just deal with the ledger lines. But other instrumentalists don't like to read lots of ledger lines. So in order to keep all of those notes sort of on the staff, they just switch clefs. Okay. And let me erase a little bit of my keyboard here so I can get to this side. What they do is they actually play in tenor clef. So my B gets scooted up a line, okay? And so now this is middle C. Now, this can be moved other places, okay? So this is alto clef, tenor clef, and then soprano clef is the other one. That's way down here. And you probably won't see soprano clef unless you're reading, you know, like a very old score of Bach chorales, okay? Meaning that you're gonna have 4 voices in those chorales: soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. And so each one of these clefs will actually be in that score. In fact, I can show you one at the end. So this is soprano, soprano. This is tenor. Oops. And this one is alto. And all 3 of them are what we call the movable C clefs. Okay, so of course with soprano, the C is down here. Okay, so now let's talk middle C, right? Because this is what these C clefs are all about, is this middle C business. Middle C on a keyboard, okay, is the C right in the center of the keyboard. Okay, I think it's like C 1, 2, 3, 4, C4. Okay, sometimes we use this little number designation for octaves. Okay, now for us, let's start with our clef first. Flutist's clef is that. That's our middle C. Okay, so let's just say this is C4. Okay, keyboard language C4. All right, for bass clef, this is middle C. Okay, so think about that. For us, the ledger line right below is middle C. And for the bass clef, the ledger line right above is middle C. So they're actually the same note. Okay, on the keyboard, that's the same pitch, the same range, and the same register. When we get to these clefs, our middle C can move around a little bit. So the story I said earlier, where we got cellist that wants to play really high on their fingerboard, they're going to actually end up probably switching clefs to tenor clef. So what they're doing is they're taking their middle C and they're moving it down here, right? Because that's where we said our tenor clef C was. So we're taking middle C and moving it down, which basically means we're taking that whole range and just putting it lower so that we don't need as many ledger lines. So that's really why people, you know, traditionally have used these clefs. Viola does occasionally play in treble clef, but again, it's sort of just tradition that range has sort of been right in the center. And so they've just stuck with alto clef. So they're really the only instrument that regularly uses alto clef. Sometimes singers, you know, will see this, like we mentioned in Bach chorales, and then sometimes other instruments will sometimes move a clef to keep the range of their instrument sort of on the staff. Okay, cellists are one. Bassoons do it. Occasionally we'll read in tenor clef, and trombones will occasionally read in tenor clef as well. Okay, so let me see if I can get another, you know, I don't know if I'll be able to get another page up here, but I'm going to go ahead. Before I change things, does anybody have any questions to this point? Or are you kind of just along for the ride?
Yeah, I do. Let me ask you a question. So I understand everything you said. Just from was it ultimately like just ease of visualization? So instead of having the ledger, you flip and you've always got staff lines to reference to.
Yep.
From an objective, from why it was done this way. Yeah.
Right, exactly. That's basically why it happened. And if you think about it, these clefs originated kind of at the beginning of what we call our common practice period. So that would be right around 1600. Okay. Think about what life was like in 1600, right? Paper was not super cheap. It was still sort of expensive. We did have a printing press and we could print a staff line very easily, right? And so you could get staff paper and have your manuscript paper ready for you. That was good. But then everything else was done by hand. And so the more ledger lines you have by hand, A, the more space you're going to run out of on your very expensive staff paper. B, the more likelihood it is going to be difficult for the performer to read, not because of the number of staff lines, but just because of the handwriting, right? We're going to end up with a handwriting pattern that some of the lines might be squished or might be further apart or whatever. And it might be very difficult for the performer to figure out what's going on in there. And in addition, then it's kind of taking up more ink. It's much easier to just simply write a new clef and keep everything on the printed staff you've already purchased rather than, writing all the lines out. So it was a, multifold issue, but a practical one. So it didn't really have anything necessarily to do with somebody, really particularly wanting one clef over another. It had to do with kind of necessity. And speaking of necessity, this is an interesting thing about our treble clef. So let me get a different color here so you can see it. So our treble clef can move also, not a lot, but it can be altered. So you could actually have something that looks like that. Okay. Tenor voice sometimes sings in this clef because that indicates that we can read it like treble clef, but then it's an octave lower than what it sounds. Okay. Another permutation of treble clef is actually to move this clef down here. Okay, so you see how they're a little bit different. And like I mentioned, this is the G clef. So anywhere that little loopy goes is a G. Okay, and so old French writing, like from the 1600s and 1700s, this is actually what we call violin clef, because the lowest string on a violin is an open G, and so that would be that note right there. Okay, and so with that being the lowest string, you never needed all of the lower ledger lines, right? You would only go up from there. And of course, in that era, the range was much smaller. Violin was a very different instrument, and the fingerboard was a little bit more narrow, a little shorter, I should say. It was also narrow, but a little shorter. And so we didn't have all these like Paganini crazy high, notes to play. So pretty much everything stayed on the staff. Occasionally, flutists will see this French violin clef, this pink one, in very old French manuscripts like Haute-Terre or Blavet or Brown or something like that, would come up with a French violin clef. So Amag, you've got a question. What's your question?
So isn't our middle C the C at the bottom with the line through it?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
What's the C in the space above?
This one right here.
Mm-hmm.
So in keyboard language, if this one's C4 down here, this one is C5. And so all it is simply an octave higher. And that's all we have to know about it. The interesting thing about these C4, C5 things, like I said, it really relates to the piano. So unless you're really in the know on piano writing and on, playing that kind of, notation all the time, it's not really, I don't think, super applicable to flutists, in my opinion. What I do sometimes when I'm writing in my music or my students' music, I might say this down here is C1, because that's our first C. And then this one here is C2, right? So like I said, the C1, C2, C4, C5, that kind of thing, can kind of relate to the instrument that you're playing on. But that is a really good segue. Let me see if I can clear this for a minute. Clear. Okay, I'll go back to blue. It's a very good segue into my next little topic here, which is what happens when we combine the staffs together. Okay, so we do have this thing called a grand staff. Okay, and a grand staff has treble clef on top. Remember, I said that's usually what our right hand plays when we're playing keyboard music. And the left hand plays the bass clef. And this is exactly the point that Amag had here, which is your ledger line below the staff here is a C. Okay. The ledger line above the staff here is a C. Now, my staff lines are a little bit spaced out, but stay with me. The alto clef actually sits itself right in here. So our middle C space is shared. So it's shared between our bottom end, on flute. That's kind of our lowest note or lowest C that we play. The top end on the bass clef, and then the alto clef kind of sits right in the middle. Now, one other thing that I thought would be useful to talk about today, because it's something that you're going to see in your music pretty often, is something called enharmonic notes. So I'm going to kind of start a new space here. Enharmonic. And for the sake of simplicity and for the sake of actual tradition, I mean, we don't use the alto clef a whole lot when it comes to like part writing and, talking about music and stuff like that. It's there. It's important to know. It's good to know that it shares the space in between the treble and the bass clefs. And it's good to know that violas play in that clef, because if you ever went to play viola music, you would not be able to play it with the clef that it's written in. You'd have to transpose it. And believe it or not, I've had to do that several times for wedding gigs and different things where the only thing I could get my hands on was a viola part somehow. So there's that. But anyway, with enharmonic pitches, let's just concentrate mostly on the treble and the bass clef, because those are really the clefs that, we end up using the most. Enharmonic means they are spelled differently, but they sound the same. So a really common one for us is maybe F sharp is the same as G flat. And I bet you've seen that in your music. Another really common one, C sharp, D flat, right? Now, if I got my piano back out here, did my quick piano sketch, okay? What we can do is count, or I guess maybe keep track anyway, of where our accidentals are, and then be able to assign a second note name to them. Okay, so for example, and I'll get another color here so I can show you. So for example, here's our F sharp right here. Okay, this is F, this is G. Oops, you know what? Let me erase that part, and then that'll be a little bit more clear. There. Okay, so that's F, that's G. And we know that this shared black key in between is both F sharp, which is a half step high, right? The sharp stands for raising the note a half step. Flat stands for lowering the note a half step. So F sharp is here, and then the G flat is the same actual note. Okay, so same with C sharp and D flat. So we've got a C sharp is this note right here, that black key. And then of course, D is the next note up. That black key is then D flat also. So let's practice this a little bit. How about this note here? Okay, this is A and G. So this blank key that's in between A and G, what are the two names that we can give that key?
Yeah. G sharp or A flat, yeah.
G sharp or A flat, exactly. Yeah, this happens when it's not the blank key too. So let me get another color. So let's just say this is B, and I want a B sharp. B sharp is actually the same as C natural. So on the bass clef, if I'm writing B sharp, that's enharmonic with C natural. And it can happen in E and F too. So here's E. Let's say I wanted to write F flat. Well, that's actually just E natural. I mean, it looks like E natural. So we've got F flat and E natural. Now you might be saying, okay, well, why then am I going to write F flat? Why not just write E natural? Well, the issue is actually in whatever key you're playing in. And I don't know that we'll have time to really get into key area, but basically if you have, and you've probably started scales, right? We all play scales as musicians. So let's put this in the treble clef for a minute, just because it's a little more familiar to us. Let's just say we had, let's say we had F major. Okay, so we've got F, G, A, B flat, C, D, E natural, and F. Okay, and let's just say, now we're used to reading B flat, okay, but let's just say that we had this desire to read A sharp. If we did that, right, because B flat and A sharp, same key, those are enharmonic notes. If we did that, we would basically end up with two A's in our scale. And so even though we have, a note that really is enharmonic, the scale would sound the same, whether we saw it that way, on paper or not. If we were the one reading it, or if we were the one playing it, it would not compute, because we would have two A's instead of an A and an A sharp. On top of that, you'd have to keep writing your accidentals in all the time. That's why we ended up with key signatures, right? Key signatures are just taking this accidental and putting it at the beginning of the line, right? So that you don't have to rewrite and rewrite. You're saving your ink, right? And so that's another rule that we kind of follow just in reading music then. So those are the enharmonic notes. How about this? Does anybody have any questions about this?
Lindsay, it's not really the concept, just the more from a playing standpoint. I think I know what you're talking about, but I'll ask it. So it may be just because from a frequency standpoint, I've played so much more, in G or D and A. When I get to an A flat, I just mentally, right, when it's a C sharp, and I know that it's like I'm there, it doesn't, but for whatever reason, to me, playing a D flat, and physically, just from a like a mental correlation standpoint, when I get there, it's like I can do it, but it's just I don't have the same fluidity. And is that just because it's like, David, hey, you just need to practice more in A flat and it'll happen? Is that
maybe? It could be, like any other language, the more you use it, the more fluent you get. So, my grandparents were Polish. They used to speak to each other in Polish all the time. I never learned any of it because I didn't speak it at home, but they spoke to each other all the time. And that's how they kept their language active. They just practiced it with each other. So that might be part of it, is just practicing it and realizing, that in the key of A flat, you're probably not going to have C sharps. You're going to have D flats. But it's also, it's also the way that our brains are wired. Usually when we're taught our fingerings, right, we're taught kind of, the accidentals that we're going to encounter the most often first. Now, for me, I mean, I learned in band, like, most of us do, fourth or fifth grade or whatever, and, picked up the flute and had a method book and looked to see what I needed to do in the method book. So like, for example, I learned E flat really early. So for me to play D sharp, it took a while to remember that the fingering was actually the E flat fingering, because I didn't learn it that way. I learned it first as E flat. So there's an element of that too. If you learned C sharp first because you were playing a piece that had, that was in D major, okay, so you've ingrained it that way, that it's C sharp. And so now flipping to A flat major, it might look and feel a little bit different. Another thing to think about, and this is really, really cool historically, we're talking about enharmonic pitches. This is only applicable for equal temperament. Now, we definitely don't have time to get into equal temperament today, because that is people write dissertations about temperament. But way back, even before Bach, okay, we've probably played, simple Bach pieces out of the Anna Magdalena book, or, Bach sonatas, or, that kind of thing. Before Bach, we did not have what we call equal temperament. So basically, in a very, very brief way, that means that this situation I'm talking about on the keyboard did not exist. And we actually had two different keyboards, one for the flats, one for the sharps. So F sharp and G flat were not the same note. They were actually tuned differently. And it depended on what key you were playing in, which manual, which keyboard you would have to play on. If you were playing in a flat key, well, you would have to play on the one with the flats so that your G flat was tuned correctly. If you were playing in a sharp key, you'd have to play, on the other keyboard so that your F sharp was tuned appropriately. It's a very complicated process figuring that out. And musicians and theorists, even Pythagoras, tried to figure out, differences, which is what we call a comma in temperament, so that we could kind of move our pitches around, and eventually we move them around till we have this equal tempered system. So that's why Bach's well-tempered clavier, he actually wrote in all the keys, major and minor. He wrote preludes and fugues in all the keys because he could finally. It most commonly, we would only stick to kind of the top half of the circle of fifths. And so if you know what the circle of fifths is, cool. And if not, that's okay. Basically, we would just stick to keys that didn't have a whole lot of sharps or flats in them. So there's lots of G major and E minor, and lots of D major and B minor, that kind of thing. And, as music kind of grew more complicated, this need for equal temperament grew too. However, there is something really pleasing to the ear about notes that are tuned in what we call just intonation for a particular key. So, for example, E minor is known in Baroque music for having something called the affect of death. So it's a mood that we kind of project through the key of E minor. It makes us feel like somber, like you're going to a funeral. And so composers took advantage of that. Okay. Even up into the 19th century, they took advantage of that. And G major, the parallel or the relative major, was actually considered the key of life. So, composers again took advantage of that. Why? I think it might have something to do with natural horns being in G major, and so horns tend to kind of give us that like brighter sound. And so again, the mood is projected as being kind of more lively than E minor would. So anyway, that's trust me, that is a whole other set of classes. But all that's really important is to know that enharmonic notes did not always exist. We just in kind of Bach and later have really kind of developed this equal tempered system so that we can now, as flutists, play in all the keys, and they're pretty much all the same, like homogeneous, in temperament. Before we run out of time, let me share one other page. I thought maybe it would be a good idea to just recap a little bit of what we've done here. Let me see if I can I pull up my sharing tool? Here we go. All right. So this is basically just a little bit of practice. I could share this. I'm not sure if you all can write on the screen, but you could type it into the chat, or you could just say it. Why don't we identify some notes? The top line should be pretty easy because it's treble clef, right? And we're very used to treble clef being flutists here. So let's give this a try. What do you think about this first note? Oh, I should get my chat out, right? Yes, F. Oh, let me see if I can move it. Move that there. Now I can see everything. Okay, good. Good, good, good. All right, so we've got F, and then the next one.
I'm taking them off, F sharp.
F sharp. And this is important too. The sharp and the flat always go on the left side of the note head here. That's because when we're reading it left to right, we see the sharp, or we see whatever the accidental is, and then we can apply it to the note. It's kind of a, it's a reading tool basically. But when we write it and when we speak it, we typically say the note and then the accidental. So a little bit different. And again, something you might not come across if you're just playing around in MuseScore, Noteflight, or any of those notation programs. So F sharp, and then the next one.
E natural.
E natural, you got it. Yep. And then
I think Amog wants to share. So it's a B. Yeah.
B.
Amog, your turn.
A flat.
A flat, good. Yeah, A flat. And then bottom line.
E natural.
E. Now this one we don't see very much on flute, but we do occasionally have it with that extension.
B.
B, yeah, that's a B natural. And then we play this one all the time.
A.
Close, very close.
C.
Yeah, this one's a little higher. This one's C. And then
I almost wish, Lindsay, like when you're talking about this, what I'll refer to now as stacked staffs, I almost switch, because just between my eyes, when I get into the real high notes, I still sometimes I have to, there's a freeze on, oh, is that a G? Is that a B? Is that a, and so I'm like jealous of because I'd love a stacked staff, but anyway, I'll work on it. Yeah, it's like
I think that has been kind of played around with in various contexts. I don't know about you, but I've definitely seen some notation programs, that printed music, that the ledger lines kind of bleed together a little bit. And so let's just say you had a whole bunch of stuff above the staff, right? If those ledger lines kind of come together, I think for me anyway, it's much harder to read. It would be great to have an extended staff, but I'd have to retrain my brain to read all the spaces and everything. So I feel like 5 is kind of the limit, for how much the brain can process. And then start counting.
Yeah, you're right. I think for me, it's more like the size of the printed music. When I go back to my Reichert book, where it's the Reichert book compared to the Trevor Y, it's kind of flat. The resolution isn't good. It's much smaller print. And like you said at the beginning of the session, you might know, I'll a lot of times freeze between an A and a C, which is it? And then I'm looking at it. I can't. And again, my eyes aren't what they were when I was a Mog's age. But but deal with it, David.
Well, part of it is just kind of getting used to it. And I think to some extent, maybe it's just a little bit of memorization too, like learning, again, I'm going to make this analogy, like learning a language. If we had to, like my daughter's in the first grade. She's memorizing, verbs of being. Verbs of being are, uh, what are they? Is, are, was, were, has, have, had, be, been. You know what I mean? Like I mean, we know what those words are when we're speaking English, but she's at the stage where she's just memorizing it. And so some of it is that too, a little bit of memory and a little bit of use and just, being fluent in it. Anyway, what's the next one here?
G sharp.
G sharp, excellent. And then
C.
C, the one right above it is
D.
D. And now we've got a lower one.
G,
G. Yeah. And then the last two.
D.
E and
I can't see the pictures in the way. What is it?
oh.
Let me get rid of it. Yeah, I can't. Okay, I got it. Yeah. E flat.
E flat, good. And like I said, this is the clef that we work in all the time. So this was pretty easy. Let's do a couple of notes on the bass clef and a couple of notes on the alto clef. And these ones are going to be a little bit trickier because we don't, think about these clefs all the time. But remember, let's see, I don't know if I have enough space to write them on here, but we can try. So the acronyms that I've learned are good boys do fine always, and then all cows eat grass. Okay. So it might be a little bit hard to read there in the middle of the clef, but that's our guide. So looking at that, where do we start? Let's just do up to here. Okay. So what's the first note there?
D flat.
D flat. And then this one's tricky.
All right. It's going to be C. The
Close.
second one.
Close.
What are you at? Oh, you're there. Okay.
This is actually C, but this is a D natural. So yeah, the first one was D flat. The upper one, if this top line is A and then the space is B, this is C, and then above that is D. So we got a D, we got a C. And then how about this?
Top line on the staff is A, and that first line above, I've got yeah, okay.
Yep. So all cows eat grass. What's this one here?
G.
G, good. And then a step below that
Is D.
close. It would be D in treble clef. Yeah. F. That's an F flat, which also is really weird. Weird note, right? And then we're back to our all cows eat grass. What's this one? Next one.
E.
Close.
Yeah.
All cows. This one's a C. Because it's the second space. And then good boys do fine always.
G.
G, yeah, exactly. Good. So like I said, that's it again, much more difficult when it's not a clef that you're using all the time, Now here's a little trick when we get to alto clef. We said that the middle is C. Okay, this spot right here is C. As a flutist, we're really reading one line or one space up from that as being C, right? So take what you see here in the first half and read it one space up. So for example, this would be A flat. This is A natural, right? So
Yeah.
what would this one be?
G.
G. This one?
Right, I'm off, yeah. D.
That one's D. Yeah, this one's a lot harder. C flat because it's the middle, right? And then down on the bottom,
G,
G and
D.
D. Yeah. So again, making the language analogy, I remember sitting in Italian class in college after having taken a couple years of German in high school. And, the teacher asking something in Italian and me wanting to respond in German. And it's, yeah, your body, well, your brain uses what it knows. It pulls on previous knowledge to kind of fill in the gaps. And even if you can compute what's happening, sometimes, then my responses anyway were basically what I wanted from what I knew. So if you know treble clef really well, but the bass and the alto are a little bit, little touchy because we're not as familiar, that's the tendency is going to be to want to pull from the treble clef. So anyway, so using that to your advantage is one little trick when it comes to the alto clef there, because they are pretty close together. Okay, so a quick review on enharmonic equivalents now. Let me get a different color because there we go. Use something different here. Okay, so we said earlier D sharp is enharmonic to what other pitch?
Want to take that, Amagna?
What?
E flat, good. Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and write this up here so that if you want piano, you can check that out. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so this is C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Good. So basically this is E flat is the same enharmonic pitch. How about a G flat on the bottom? What's that enharmonic pitch?
You sure?
F sharp. Like that. And then B natural. This one's tricky.
C flat.
C flat. Yep, exactly. Okay, so bass clef. E natural. Also tricky.
Natural is going to be B. That's B.
Close. So
Oh,
we,
that's the B natural, the first one on the bass clef.
this is an E natural.
That's
Yeah. Yeah, E natural.
so
Express.
D. Is it down one?
It's interesting. We didn't get a chance to talk about this very much. If you wanted to make this a D, you could actually do D double sharp.
Yeah.
Double X is a double sharp, right?
Yeah, right.
You're not going to raise it just a half step, you raise it a whole step. And so that would be equivalent because you get D, D sharp, E, right? And that could work. The other one is F flat. So F flat. And that one is obviously just one half step down. Just like double sharps, we do have double flats as well. And that's just a BB, two flat signs, as opposed to just the one flat sign. And they operate exactly the same way. So where the double sharp raises things 2 half steps, the double flat lowers things 2 half steps. So anyway, so that does complicate the enharmonic equivalency thing, but there are other notes that technically are correct here too. Yeah. G sharp. What's the enharmonic equivalent to G sharp?
A flat.
A flat. Very good. Yep. A flat. And then F sharp. Oh, sorry. I'm in the wrong clef. Hello.
Well, exactly.
Hello.
I was treble clef. Yeah, sorry.
B sharp. I forgot we were in bass clef. B sharp is equivalent to
C flat.
Now this is interesting, but since we only have 12 half steps on the piano, we don't have flat keys between every pair. So B sharp is actually just C natural.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it. B and C is one half step, and then E to F is the other one that's missing a black key.
Okay. That's very
Um,
nice.
A sharp would be equivalent to B flat. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Very good. That was a lot. That was a lot of work today. And as you can see, this is a pretty packed topic. So, there's an awful lot to practice here with this. If it is, would it be helpful if I sent a little worksheet or something to practice this, or some links for some resources to practice?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to absorb everything in just an hour.
I don't like take notes down.
Yeah.
Like it's getting crammed into my head.
Oh
So
yeah. Oh yeah. And like I said, you wouldn't expect to learn a language in an hour. I mean, you learn a couple little things, but then you have to practice it to get it to stick. So it's exactly the same with music. So yeah, so I can we'll finish up here with any questions you have. And then when I send out the link later with the video, I'll send it with a worksheet, just, as a little bit of practice. Does anyone have any other questions before we go?
No, that was good. Mark, you said what grade did you say you were in, or
sorry, what?
you're a student? You said, aren't you a student? What grade did you say you were in?
I'm in 6th grade.
In 6th grade.
I think you said you had a teacher. Well, this isn't a plug, but I'm an intermediate, an old hobbyist. So, but I've had a few different teachers, and if it didn't work out with your current teacher, I'll tell you that Lindsay, she's awesome. She'd take you to the Juilliard School of Music, whatever you want. She's incredible. So, and I think all of her students would say, that wasn't a plug. She didn't tell me to say that. I just
No, I didn't, but that's okay. Thanks, David.
so, you're a teacher. Yeah, go take lessons with her. So
Yeah.
So, if there's no other questions, why don't we end there? And I'll get all of this packaged up for everybody and send it out via email later. And yeah, thank you all for being here today. This was really fun. I'm glad we can. I'll see you next month on the 9th.
And I'll see you in an hour, I think, right? A week.
I'll see you later today. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Nice to meet you, Mom. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.